Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder historian, and Lieutenant General James Longstreet needs no introduction to Civil War circles, but beyond his career in the Army in Northern Virginia, many people seem to leave out or write off his time in East Tennessee as trivial. After the Battle of Chickamauga and before the battles of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, Braxton Bragg, the commander of the Army of Tennessee, detached Longstreet and his corps to Knoxville to secure the city and cut the Union forces in Chattanooga off from reinforcements in and around Knoxville. Longstreet launched a failed assault on Fort Sanders at Knoxville, and this is his account. The city stands on the right bank of the Holston River on a plateau about 1.5 miles in width and extending some miles down south. At Knoxville, the plateau is 120 feet above the river, and there are little streams called First, Second, and Third Creeks from the upper to the lower suburbs of the city. First Creek between the city and East Knoxville, or Temperance Hill. Second Creek between the city and College Hill. Third Creek below and outside the enemy's lines of defense. The plateau slopes down to the valley through which the railway passes, and west of the valley it rises to the usual elevation. The Confederates were posted on the second plateau with their batteries of position. The line of the enemy's work, starting at its lower point on the west bank of the river, was just above the mouth of the Second Creek, lying at right angles to the river. It ran to a fort constructed by the Confederates when occupied by them years before, called Fort Loudon, above the Kingston Road and about 1,000 yards in front of the college. East from that point, it was about parallel with the river, reaching to Temperance Hill, to Mabry's Hill, and to Holston, below the glassworks. An interior line extended from Temperance Hill to Flint Hill on the east, and another on the west, between the outer line and Second Creek. Dams were built across First and Second Creeks, flooding and forming formidable wet ditches over extensive parts of the line. Abatis, chevaux de frise, and wire entanglements were placed where thought to be advantageous for the defenders. The heights on the northeast across the river were much more elevated than the plateau of the city side, and command all points of the west bank. These were defended at some points by earthworks well manned. From the lower point of the enemy's line, the Confederates extended to his right at the river, conforming to his defensive lines. The part of our line occupied by cavalry was a mere watchguard. Our move was hurried and our transportation so limited that we had only a few tools in the hands of small pioneer parties, and our wagons were so engaged in collecting daily rations that we found it necessary to send our cavalry down to Lenore's for the tools captured there for use in making rifle pits for our sharpshooters. When General Burnside rode to the front to meet us at Lenore's, he left General Parke in command at Knoxville, and he and Captain Poe of the engineers gave attention to his partially constructed works. Upon laying our lines about Knoxville, the enemy's forces in the northeast of his department were withdrawn towards Cumberland Gap. We had no information of the troops ordered to meet us from southwest Virginia. The enemy's line of sharpshooters in Fort Sanders stood in our direct line of advance, the fort manned by the heaviest and best field guns. Benjamin's battery, an old familiar acquaintance who had given us many hard knocks in our eastern service, opened upon us as soon as we were in its reach. It was not until the night of the 17th that our line was well established, and then only so as to enclose the enemy's front, leaving the country across the river to be covered when the troops from Virginia should join us. When General McLaws advanced on the morning of the 18th, he found the enemy's line of skirmishers, cavalry dismounted, behind a line of heavy rail defenses. General Alexander was ordered to knock the rails about them and drive them out, and was partially successful, but the enemy got back before our infantry could reach them. So we had to carry the line by assault. Part of our line drove up in fine style and was measurably successful, but other parts, smarting under the stiff musket fire, hesitated and lay down under such light shelter as they could find, but close under fire, so close that to remain inactive would endanger repulse. Our sharpshooters were advanced from night to night and pitted before daylight, each line being held by new forces as the advance was made. The first line occupied was a little inside of the rail piles. It seemed probable upon first examination of the line along the northwest that we might break through, and preparations were made for that effort, but upon closer investigation it was found to be too hazardous, and that the better plan was to wait the approach of the other forces. When within 600 yards of the enemy's works, our lines well pitted, it seemed safe to establish a battery on an elevated plateau on the east or south side of the river. Some of our troops were sent over in flatboats, and the reconnaissance revealed an excellent point commanded the city and the enemy's lines of works. Fort Loudon afterwards called for the gallant Sanders, who fell defending it, was a bastion earthwork, built upon an irregular quadrilateral. From the fort the ground sloped in a heavy grade, from which the trees had been cut and used as abattis, and wire network was stretched between the stumps. On the 22nd, General McLaws thought his advance near enough the works to warrant assault. He was ordered to it with assaulting columns supported by the division. General Jenkins was also ordered up, and General Wheeler was ordered to push his troops and his horse artillery forward as McLaws' attack opened, so that the entire line would engage and hold to steady work till all the works were carried. After consulting with his officers, General McLaws reported that they preferred to have daylight for their work. Our cavalry, except a brigade left at Kingston, resumed its position on the left of our line on the 26th. On the 23rd, a telegram came from General Braxton Bragg to say that the enemy had moved out and attacked his troops at Chattanooga. Later in the day, he announced the enemy still in front of him, but not engaging his forces. That night, General Ledbetter, chief engineer of General Bragg's army, reported at headquarters with orders from General Bragg that we should attack at Knoxville, and very promptly. I asked him to make the reconnaissance and designate the assailable points. At the same time, he was asked to consider that the troops from Virginia were on the march and would join us in 8 or 10 days, when our investment could be made complete, that the enemy was then on half rations and would be obliged to surrender in 2 weeks, also whether we should assault fortifications and have the chance of repulse rather than wait for a surrender. From his reconnaissance he pronounced Fort Sanders the assailable point, but after riding around the lines with General Jenkins and General Alexander, he pronounced in favor of assault from our left at Mabry's Hill. On the 27th, after more thorough reconnaissance in company with my officers, he came back to his conclusion in favor of assault at Fort Sanders. I agreed with him that the field at Mabry's Hill was too wide and the march under fire too long to warrant attack at that point. He admitted that the true policy was to wait and reduce the place by complete investment, but claimed that the crisis was on, the time imperative, and the assault must be tried. The order was given for the 28th, but the weather became so heavy and murky as to hide the fort from view of our artillery, so operations were put off until the 29th. On the 28th, reports were brought of an advance of Union troops from the direction of Cumberland Gap. The cavalry under General W. E. Jones was sent to arrest their march pending operations ordered for the 29th, and he was authorized to call the artillery and infantry marching from Virginia to his assistance if the force proved formidable. The assault was made by the brigades of Generals Wofford, Humphreys, and Bryan at the appointed time and in admirable style. The orders were that not a musket should be discharged except by the sharpshooters, who should be vigilant and pick off every head that might appear above the parapets until the fort was carried. The troops marched steadily and formed regularly along the outside of the works around the ditch. I rode after them with the brigades under General B. R. Johnson until within 500 yards of the fort, whence we could see our advance through the gray of the morning. A few men were coming back wounded. Major Goggin of General McLaw's staff, who had been at the fort, rode back, met me, and reported that it would be useless for us to go on, that the enemy had so surrounded the fort with network of wire that it was impossible for the men to get in without axes, and that there was not an axe in the command. Without a second thought, I ordered the recall, and ordered General Johnson to march his brigades back to their camps. He begged to be allowed to go on, but given full faith to the report, I forbade him. I had known Major Goggin many years. He was a classmate at West Point and had served with us in the field and practical experience, so that I had confidence in his judgment. Recall was promptly sent General Jenkins and his advance brigade under General Anderson, but the latter, seeing the delay at the fort, changed his direction outside the enemy's works and marched along their front to the ditch, and was there some little time before he received the order. In his march and countermarch in front of the enemy's line, he lost 4 killed and 33 wounded. As a diversion in favor of the assaulting columns, our troops on the south side were ordered to a simultaneous attack, and to get in on that side if the opportunity occurred. This demonstration had the effect anticipated in detaining troops to hold on that side that were intended as reserve for the fort. Just after the troops were ordered back, it occurred to me that there must be some mistake about the wire network, for some of our men had been seen mounting and passing over the parapets, but it was too late to reorganize and renew the attack. I conceived that some of the regimental pioneers should have been at hand prepared to cut the wires, but all had been armed to help swell our ranks. Since reading the accounts of General Poe, the engineer in charge of the works, I am convinced that the wires were far from being the serious obstacle reported, and that we could have gone in without the use of axes. And from other reports it appears that most of the troops had retired from the fort, leaving about 150 infantry with Benjamin's battery. Our muskets from the outside of the parapet could have kept the infantry down. Johnson's brigades would have been at the ditch with me in 10 minutes, when we would have passed over the works. Hence it seems conclusive that the failure was due to the order of the recall. It is not part of my nature to listen to reports that always come when stunning blows are felt, but confidence in the conduct of war was broken, and with it the tone and spirit for battle, further impaired by the efforts of those in authority to damage, if not prevent, the success of work ordered in their own vital interest. After the repulse, General Burnside was so considerate as to offer a flag of truce for time to remove our killed and wounded about his lines. About half an hour after the repulse, and while yet on the slope leading up to the fort, Major Branch of Major General Ransom's staff came with a telegram from the President informing me that General Bragg had been forced back by superior numbers, and ordering me to proceed to cooperate with his army. Orders were issued at once for our trains to move south, and preparations were begun for a move of the troops after nightfall. In the afternoon, word came from General Wheeler, authorized by General Bragg, that I should join him, if practicable, at Ringgold. Confederate loss in the assault, 822. Union loss in the assault, 673. Confederate losses during the campaign, 1,296. Union losses during the campaign, 1,481.